Hello everyone, so today we're going to go over section 8.0, adding and subtracting integers. So just a quick review on what integers are, but before that also what whole numbers are. So whole numbers are counting numbers starting at 0. So that would be 0, 1, 2, 3, and so forth. Now integers are positive and negative counting numbers, and of course also 0. So for example, it will look like um, from negative infinity to, and then negative 3, negative 2, negative 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, and so forth. So one way to illustrate all this is to use a number line. Here we have 0 in the middle of a number line, and then to its right are the positive integers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then on the other side, we have negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5, and negative 6. Okay, so once again, to the right of 0, we have increasing positive integers. And to the left of 0, the integers increases negatively. So just like that. One of the things we want to be able to do with integers is to compare them. So for example, we know that 2 is less than 5. We have an arrow pointing this way. Next up, we have negative 2, which is less than 8. 1 is greater than negative 5. And finally, negative 6 is less than negative 5. Okay, and that is the numbers to the right are greater than the numbers to the left on the number line. So every integer except for 0 has a corresponding one with the opposite sign. So for example, 5 to the right of 0 is positive 5, and 5 to the left of 0 is negative 5. Likewise, the opposite of negative 2 is positive 2, and the opposite of 321 is negative 321. Okay. So as we mentioned at the beginning, we are looking at adding and subtracting integers. We will start with adding integers. In the first case, this is positive 3 plus positive 2, which in other words is really just 3 plus 2. And we know that this has a sum of 5. So next up, we have 5 plus negative 6. So one way to illustrate what is happening is to use counters. So we have 5 positive 1 counters. Just going to draw circles to represent those. And then we have 6 negative 1 counters. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Notice that each pair of positive and negative 1 counters would have a sum of 0. So what we can do is to eliminate each pair. And we'll notice that the only counter left over is -1. So 5 plus -6 is equal to -1. Okay. So that's one way to think about adding integers, especially when they are negative. Okay. So something else that you may have seen before is to consider the adding of a negative integers to be just subtraction. So we have in example C, 1C, -2 plus -1, which is the same as -2 minus 1. So we are starting at -2 and moving farther to the left, which means we have a sum of -3. Okay. Similarly, in the last example, we start at -3 and then we move 5 spaces to the right. So that will result in +2. Okay. So let's examine example 1C and 1D further by looking at an example with number lines. It says here, when adding two integers using a number line, mark the first number on the number line. If we're adding a positive integer, we will move to the right. And if we are adding a negative integer, we'll move to the left. Okay. So let's look at example 2. Add the following using a number line and record the result. So 2a, -3 plus 4. So we'll start at -3. 1, 2, 3. So here. And then we're adding a positive integer. We're going to move to the right 4 spaces. So to indicate that, simply going to draw a line, moving 4 spaces to the right. And that takes us to +1. Okay, so the sum of -3 plus 4 is +1, or just 1. Okay, likewise, in the second example, we start at +5. So here we go. And then, since we're adding -6, we're going to move 6 spaces to the left. Which will take us to -1. And that will be the sum. Okay, and finally, we start at a negative integer, -2 in this case. And then if we're adding a negative integer, which causes us to move to the left, in this case, 3 spaces, we end at -5. Okay, so let's try to add integers without models. Starting with example A, -6 plus -4. So we start at -6, we're going to move 4 spaces to the left, which causes the result to be a more negative number, and we will end with -10. Okay. Next example, we start at -6 and move 4 spaces to the right, so not quite positive or even at 0 yet. We'll end at -2. from there, example C, negative 10 plus 12. So we start 10 spaces to the left of 0, and then we move 12 spaces to the right, and we'll end at positive 2, or just 2. Okay. Next one is 23 plus negative 21. So we start at 23 and move 21 spaces to the left, which gives us a sum of, again, 2. From there, we have negative 10 plus negative 7. So we start at negative 10 and move 7 spaces to the left, which results in a more negative number, negative 17 in this case. And finally, if there are multiple addition, we're going to complete one at a time, moving from left to right. So in this case, negative 9 plus negative 4 would give us negative 13. And negative 13 plus 13 will give us 0. Okay. So that should give us a good idea on how to add integers with and without models. Moving on to subtraction. So see here, it's would have been a review question. We start at negative 5 and then move 3 spaces to the right, and we have a sum of negative 2 in this case. Next up, we're going to find the difference and subtract integers. Okay, first case should be fairly straightforward. 7 minus 3 is 4. Notice that both of those integers are positive, and the second one is less than the first. So it is typical of subtracting whole number question that we have seen before. Okay. Next one is a little bit different. We have negative 5 minus negative 2. So one way to look at this question is to use counters. And we'll start with 5 negative 1 counters to represent the negative 5 that we began with. So here we are. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then we are going to subtract negative 2, which really just means to take away negative 2. So here's a negative 1, negative 2. And notice that we are left with 3 negative 1 counters. So the difference is going to be negative 3. Okay. Similarly, the next example we have here, negative 4 minus negative 4. Okay, so let's look at how this will work with counters. So we have 4 negative 1 counters for negative 4. And then we're going to take away negative 4, which means we're going to take away all 4 of these negative 1 counters. So they will be gone. And the end result is 0 counters. So we will have 0 as the difference. Okay. Let's look at a couple more complex examples. In this first case, we have negative 3 minus negative 5. So similar to what we did before, we start with 3 negative 1 counters. So 1, 2, and 3. Notice that it is impossible for us to take away 5 negative 1 counters because we just don't have that many. So what we'll need to do is add in a couple of 0 pairs to be taken away. So we will need 2 0 pairs. Okay. So now we have a grand total of negative 5 counters that could be taken away, but the overall sum of all the counter is still negative 3. Okay, so there is a 0 pair here, and there's a 0 pair here. And then from there, we can take away -5. And we're left with two +1 counters. So the difference is actually going to be +2. Okay. And now the last example, we have 4 minus -2. So we'll begin with 4 +1 counters. Now in this case, notice that we cannot take away -2 counters because we don't have any negative counters to begin with. We only have positive counters. So similar to the previous example, we need to add in a couple of 0 pairs. So in this case, we're going to add a couple of 0 pairs this way. And then the red counter is just underneath. So this is equal to 0, of course. These two counters together and these two counters as well is equal to 0. So once again, if we look at the entire picture, the total number of counters is +4. But now we can take away -2 counters. And that's how we subtract. Now, the end result will be a total of 6 positive counters. So +6 is the difference when we subtract 4 minus -2. So another way to think about some of these subtraction questions is to rewrite them as addition questions. So in the case of first one, when we're taking away a negative, we can rewrite this as -5 plus 2. Notice that it has the same result of -3. Likewise, in the second case, we have -4 plus 4, which will give us a sum of 0. Here, this is -3 plus 5, with a sum of 2. And finally, 4 plus 2 is equal to 6. All right. So let's look at some questions where we find the difference. For some of these, we are going to rewrite them as adding questions. So in this first case here, -3 minus -6, we're going to rewrite it as -3 plus 6. And that will give us a sum of 3. Likewise, for the second example, -1 plus 4. The answer is also +3. From there, 5 minus -3 is the same as 5 plus 3, which is a sum of 8. Okay. So whenever we're subtracting a negative integer, we can always rewrite the question as adding the opposite, which is the positive version of that same integer. So here we have 3 plus 3, which is 6. Now, it is also possible to rewrite examples 3, E, and F as addition question as well. So here we have -3 minus 4. So that actually is the same thing as -3 plus -4. Okay, which will result in -7. Likewise here, -2 minus 6 is the same as -2 plus -6 for a total of -8. Of course, it's also possible to draw counters to model these subtraction questions, but doing what we just did is a little bit quicker. Okay. So to summarize what we just looked at, subtracting a positive integer is equivalent to adding the negative equivalent. And subtracting a negative integer is the same as adding the positive equivalent. Okay, which means now we should be able to subtract without using models. Okay, let's look at the first example here. It says -6 minus -4, so that would be the same thing as -6 plus 4. So that simply is -2. 7 minus -8 is the same thing as 7 plus 8, which is 15. -10 minus 8, we can rewrite as -10 plus -8. So that would be -18. Next we have -5 plus 14. So the sum was +9. -12 minus 7 is the same as -12 plus -7. So the result should be more negative, so -19 in this case. 30 plus 6, if we were to rewrite example F, so that would be 36 in total. And the last couple of examples here, again, if we're dealing with multiple subtraction, we will move from left to right one at a time. So in this first case, we have 11 minus 12, which has a difference of -1. Okay. Now, if we wanted to be more complete in showing work, we can also mention here that 11 minus 12 is the same as 11 plus -12, which of course is equal to -1. And then from there, -1 minus -13 is the same as -1 plus 13. And that will give us +12. Okay, and here, very similar in example H. 63 minus -9 is the same as 63 plus 9, which gives us a sum of 72. So this question simplifies to just 72 minus 80. Again, we can rewrite this as a addition question, so 72 plus -80, or we could just leave it as subtraction. That's okay too. So the difference or the sum, depending on which version of the question that we did, is -8. Oops, that's better. Okay, so that is how to add and subtract integers with and without models. And that's it for today, so thank you for listening.